I'm Rebecca Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies here at UC Berkeley School of Law. You're joining us for the last talk in the Helen Diller Institute's Fall Literary Series, and we will also have a spring one. The literary series is hosted and curated by Yael Segalovitz. And you can find the previous recordings in this series on our website at hdi.berkeley.edu. Today's talk is entitled A Dictionary of Lost Words, Creative Writing and Relocating Language During After War. Ben-Tovim will join Yael Segalovitz for a conversation about writing about war during war. They will explore the role writing can have in navigating the abrupt, difficult, and frequent transitions between war and civilian life, and the ways writing can give voice to otherwise silent and silenced experiences. It feels important to connect the theme of today's conversation to real-world events, which I know you will also do, and I know our speakers will address a number of related topics. We've witnessed a ceasefire, the return of living hostages to Israel, an exchange of Palestinian prisoners, the slow and painful return of bodies of hostages, and ongoing violations to the ceasefire. The current peace feels fragile, volatile, and hopeful. Even if the current peace can hold, Israelis and Palestinian civilians and soldiers will be processing trauma and navigating the after effects of this war for many years to come. Hopefully some of them will find their way to the pen and the laptop to write. And the conversation today is critically located in this broader context. A bit about the Helen Diller Institute. The Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for students and faculty through its two programs, one in Israel Studies and the other on Jewish law, thought, and identity. The Institute houses an undergraduate fellowship of 40 students, brings visiting faculty from Israel and U.S. universities to teach and research at UC Berkeley, and hosts the university's undergraduate minor in Israel Studies, offers dozens of lectures and programs for the public and campus communities, like the one you see today. All of the programs and activities and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community, and we thank you for your continued support. I'm thrilled now to welcome Ben-Tovim. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where he is a colleague of Yael Segalovitz's. He was a Kreitman postdoctoral fellow and won the Dan David Prize for postdoctoral research in 2017. Ben-Tovim focuses on the war writing tradition of the 20th and 21st centuries, and he works on the intersection of war, writing, trauma studies, and disability studies. His first book, Poetic Prosthetics, Trauma and Language in Contemporary Veterans Writing, was published as part of Edinburgh University's Press Advances in Critical Military Studies series in 2022. A second book project, loosely titled Killing Seasons, War and Nature, 1914 to 2024, is scheduled to come out in 2026 via the Edinburgh University Press Critical Studies in War and Culture series. I'm also excited to welcome back Yael Segalovitz, our host and curator, who will moderate this discussion as she has many others for us, and will do so again in the spring. Yael Segalovitz is a Helen Diller Institute visiting professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at UC Berkeley and an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She earned her PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley in 2018, where she was a Townsend Center and Posen Fellow. At the Helen Diller Institute, she has been teaching courses on Hebrew literature and translation, and she has also been curating and facilitating a public literary series featuring leading Israeli writers and scholars, including Ayelet Sabari, Sarai Shavit, Ayelet Gunder Goshen, Maya Arad, Nana Ariel, and today's program is part of that wonderful series. Her research spans American, Hebrew, and Brazilian modernisms with a focus on transnational literary exchanges and translation. Her recent book, How Close Reading Made Us, The Transnational Legacies of New Criticism, traces the global circulation of close reading beyond the Anglophone world and its influence on modernist literary production in Hebrew and Portuguese. Her current projects explore the resurgence of psychoanalytic object relations theory in the American humanities, and the representation of sleep and psychic rest in Hebrew literature. She also co-hosts the podcast Psychoanalyterature, featuring conversations with leading scholars at the intersection of psychoanalysis and literature. So please join me in welcoming both Ron Ben-Tovim and Yael Segalovitz.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and it's an even greater pleasure to speak to Ron, who knows that I don't only admire his poetic writing, but also the poetic nature of his theoretical work. And he will also talk to us about the quite extraordinary project that he still holds and initiated at Ben-Gurion University of making workshops for soldiers coming out of war in Israel right now, and I think also past wars. We don't lack those, and really trying to navigate their journey through writing. So I want to open with a short quote from Ron's theoretical book, Poetic Prosthetics, that maybe just will give you kind of a sound of his writing, but also a basic concept of what he thinks about the work of poetry and the work of healing or dealing with violence. He writes, in terms both practical and theoretical, this book, and I would say his overall project, focuses on the work required by veterans as well as by their families to transform the insufferable pain of silence and disability into a livable, if uneasy, coexistence with life in the wake of violence. And I want to start with the most difficult question, which is, looking at the destruction in Gaza, is there even a place to talk about the suffering of the Israeli soldier?
First of all, thank you for everyone for coming, and thank you, Yael, for being Yael, and thank you for that horrible question.
There are many others.
That I can't wait. I think the kind of easiest way for me to answer that is that there is always a reason not to talk about individual pain. And one of those reasons is a kind of a discussion of greater or seemingly not as great destruction or cost of war, right? I always give the example of my grandmother, who is 91, who was born in former Serbia, Hungary, and survived the Second World War as a child. And every time she described kind of strange adventures, or misadventures, I should say, of trying to survive the Holocaust, she would somehow eventually say, and I excuse the Hebrew for a second, "אבל זה לא היה Auschwitz," right? So it wasn't Auschwitz, right? So whatever it is that happened to me really isn't interesting to an extent or important, because other people went through something that is more significant and more, I would say, in my words, like as a grandson and as someone who studies and, you know, researches these and thinks about this issue, that certain kinds of pain have this kind of fluctuating variance regarding what kind of the discourse is of the time. And regarding where that discourse fluctuates, there's always going to be people not ready to talk about their pain, not able to talk about their pain. And just as a person who has access to people around me, right? So this might get to a later question, so I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I was sitting in my office, and my office is a very depressing place for most people, very happy for me. We can talk about why that is. But there are stacks of horrible books about horrible things. And there are pictures about horrible things on the wall. I really kind of like to cocoon myself in catastrophe. And I was sitting in my office, and a very real catastrophe was raging outside. And I felt like, what's the point of even doing everything that I do if there's no way for me to translate what I'm doing here to people literally outside my door. So not necessarily my own personal students, but students at large in my university. And so that kind of prompted me to try to to do what I can, and we can talk about that if you'd like, in order to kind of see what I could do, basically, right? And so within the confines of what I can do, there's things where I can't really do. I can't do a workshop of the real pain and suffering suffered by specifically, say, Palestinian women in Gaza, because I'm not the right person to orchestrate that workshop. I'm not the right person to lead that workshop. But what I can do is try to take people who, from my own experience and from my experience as a human being in Israel with parents and grandparents, and from my experience as a scholar who studies these things, if you don't allow people to talk about their pain as soon as possible, it's very likely they will never talk about it ever again. And next time it'll pop out, it's either in an offhand comment apropos of absolutely nothing. I have a famous example of that, driving through the Golan Heights with my dad, who never talked about his military service ever, and then him saying, last time I was here, there was tanks were burning and it smelled like burning bodies. And I'm like, all right, I don't know what to do with that right now, right? It's a window that was open for a moment and then it was shut, and that's it. And so if I can take a very small group of people, irregardless of the horrendous, abject destruction that some of them were participants in, which kind of complicates that issue, obviously, then I can do what I can do to make their lives somehow more bearable in the long run, even if they never write ever again. So I don't know if that answers the question, but...
It really does, and it brings about many other questions. The first one is really, if we're already talking about the workshops, and I will ask maybe later on the administrative force it took to bring that into a higher education institution. But if we can jump that into the actual rooms of the workshops, who came in, how were the workshops structured? And I think one more thing that interests me is that the view of masculinity in Israel, and I would say in the US as well, is also about not speaking pain, right? So I wonder who are the people, the students that were able to take on that venture and walk into the workshop?
I would say that just to kind of contextualize, so the reason there was a workshop was because my research was already, in humanities terms, quite grounded in real life, right? Because I was looking at my PhD, and then my first book focused on American and British soldiers who came out of Afghanistan and Iraq and posted online poetry about their exploits and about their pains in places where really no one would ever read their poems. So it was kind of a publishing, non-publishing type of situation. And I was asking myself, why go ahead and do that? Why go to the deepest recesses of some weird military form that really no one reads and no one comments on, and write a poem or publish a poem about your time at the Falkland Wars? And so the answer I gave to that is because they had to. And then the next question is, well, then why? And that's where to Rina's comment yesterday, metaphor of the prosthesis, but I think in a way very real prosthesis came about. This idea that language suffers something during war, not just exclusively during war. During the wide gamut of horrible experiences that human beings can endure, but also war, and that there's a disconnect that's created as a result of your inability to talk or use words, normal everyday words, to describe very abnormal, extreme, horrible, frightening events. And then the way out of that impasse, which is very painful and at times dangerous impasse, is to write weirdly, I guess you could say. And this writing weirdly in a very kind of reverse engineering kind of way is what we call literature. Right? Literature is people writing weirdly or forcing words to do things they are, quote unquote, not supposed to do. And so if I'll do like a slide shift. Is that okay?
Of course.
So this is one of the poems that I dealt with quite a bit, and I know I was graciously invited to participate in Yael's class yesterday, so whoever was there knows this poem. But this is written by a British Falkland War veteran, and it's a poem about really this, right? About I am writing now a poem because other ways would not work to comment about the fact that language doesn't work.
Do you want to read the poem for us?
Sure. It's called, the poet's name is Trace Corral, and the name of the poem is Burying the Dead. Burying the dead is a metaphor. They don't literally mean bury the dead. Try not to think too much about it. They mean put things to rest. Pull your socks up. Stop harping on. Get on with it. Let things lie. Get a grip. Forget. They've never buried the dead, literally. Right? So there's this, it's almost as if there's a very strange act of interpretation. And the reason I say strange is because when someone, a dear, like a loved one, wants to know what's up with their veteran friend or family member, what they want to know is what happened and how you feel. And I would put that, kind of qualify that they don't always really want to know, but they want to go through the motions of wanting to know. And this isn't necessarily helpful. Like this is not the most direct, simple way to say everything that I'm saying instead of them, right? I can't speak about it. I feel like I'm obligated to speak for other people who didn't survive like I do. I feel guilty for living, and they are heroes for dying. How do I even use the same words you use, right, with me right now to describe a situation that is just out of this world? How do I bring the ordinary and the extreme together? No one says that. You need a PhD and a good long therapy to do that. And I'm only halfway there, I think. And so that wouldn't be accessible to them. This would be. Everyone could do this. I mean, it's a very beautiful poem. Not everyone can write a beautiful poem, granted. But everyone can do this. Everyone can signal that language is broken and I am distant from you. And you say things like, get a grip. And I can't get a grip because you and me, we don't use words the same way. We use the same words. So it's not like an Italian Hebrew problem. We use the same words and we completely misunderstand each other to the point of feeling accosted, right? And so that, my background as a scholar is what really pushed me to get out into that corridor outside my office and then first think, well, this is kind of crazy, what should I do? And I don't know if Yael remembers this, but my act of bravery was to say to Yael and to another colleague of ours, how about we do a workshop? Because I have no idea how to lead a workshop. I've never been to a workshop. I feel woefully unequipped to lead anything like that. So I just said, I'll just throw that word in the air, workshop. And then Yael said, you should talk to Shimon Adaf, who's a very talented Israeli writer who works one floor down, because he does have workshop
And will be coming
experience.
to see us in February.
This is all a preview. This is all a marketing ploy.
Well done.
Yeah, thank you. And I did. I said, I don't know him personally. I set up a meeting. I said, look, we should do this. And he said, sounds like a great idea, but who's going to take responsibility over the fact that you're poking your needle at these balloons of traumatic pain? There can't be two writers in that room doing that. You need someone who has a therapy, medical background to kind of do that with you. And then I was like, all right, never mind. And then kind of through the twists of fate, I found someone at the university, a professor of social work with an emphasis on art therapy, who I said, how about we do it? I also liked the idea of doing it with a woman because of the issues that might be raised for some female participants with a male leader of the workshop. And she said, that's a great idea.
Also because we're smarter.
And also because you're smarter. That I took
Women.
that into account when yes. And she said, great, but I don't want to lead it. I was like, fine. And then she said, I have a student who's a social worker who specializes in a kind of a cottage industry that propped up in Israel the last few years of what's called emotional work-through workshops. Sometimes the military arranges them, sometimes individual NGOs and so on, making sure that soldiers aren't just thrust out of the most traumatic experiences into like working at the supermarket. And so me and him, his name is Roni, so that's the perpetual joke, Ron Veroni, and another professor who is a social sciences professor who specializes in conflict resolution. So that became the working group that started the workshop, which I lead with Roni. So he's the social worker, and so if they want to say something about emotions, they look at him. And if they want to ask a question about metaphor, they look at me. And often there's a lot of crossover, which is really became the point of the workshop. So I want to stop here, because I don't know if I already overran your question.
No, you are just bringing me to the next one, which is this beautiful metaphor, not only of the prosthesis and the phantom pain of where language once was for communication and now seems to be losing its capability of transferring meaning from one individual to the other. It's also thinking about words as tools, right, in the most concrete way. And I know you beautifully work with this idea that something in the dictionary has gone wrong, right? The ability to use the tool of language for the work that it should be doing, or that the tool remained the same but is doing something utterly different than what it was imagined to be doing beforehand. So maybe you can walk us through the way that you brought the idea of the dictionary into the workshop and what happened to it.
All right, so kind of one of the, I don't know if this is boring, this might be boring, please raise your hand if it becomes boring, but one of the background figures in my kind of education is a philosopher of language by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he has this beautiful sentiment where he says, we can't use special words to denote special meanings. That's not how a language works. A language, you can't just add an apostrophe to the word pain so that you know this is not just being burnt by a skillet, it's I feel distant from you, right? You can't just add asterisks because that's not communications anymore. That's just hurling signifiers or signs or words at each other. That's not a real act of communication. We need to deal with the fact that everyday language kind of already encapsulates all these other meanings, and it's just a question of how to eke them out. And so one of the points of the workshop, like I said before, was to, like, as soon as possible, trick them into writing before they even know what they've done. And as soon as possible, make them recognize of the fact that what they've written is writing and functions as a way of communicating their pain, whether they thought so when they were doing it or not. That's the function of the audience, right? So in a way, it's kind of, my partner Roni likes to call it almost kind of like a con. He means it in a good way. I don't hear it in a good way. Manipulation is the word he uses. That you manipulate them into believing they can already write. And one of the exercises we've built on as the workshops kind of went through, like the first, to give you an example, the first workshop is always write a letter in the second person to someone. Because the assumption is that, or one of the things that I've encountered in my work, that using the I, the first person I, when describing wartime experiences is a very non-negligible act. It's very easy to go in, it was a summer day, there was loud noises, almost like a dissociated version of their memory, and it's very difficult to position yourself through language as someone who was there. One of my favorite examples of that, by the way, is another Falkland veteran who gave one of these kind of generalized, there was sun, I heard loud noises, it was raining, and so on and so forth. And then because it's a website and each poem has this form where it has author's comments as a kind of format, which he didn't always fill, one of the author's comments was, I was there. And I was like, why is that not part of the poem? Why is was there not part of the poem? Why does he have to put it into a footnote in a way? And so the letter, for instance, the letter exercise is meant to force them into using the I as soon as possible. And another exercise we used was kind of inspired by a kind of tradition, anthropological tradition of the earlier part of the 20th century, of these anthropologists who would go into units and study how soldiers talk. And there you can find these articles still everywhere, right? Soldiers slang, Navy slang, beautiful articles that describe how certain words gain a meaning within a unit and just sticks there. One of my favorite examples, and the only time I remember myself reading a folkloristic article and laughing out loud, was a Second World War American unit that kept adding wooden to every word because one of their officers once told them to cut down those wooden trees. And you can see, you could just see it. Like an officer making, officers are simple people. And they really want to feel important. So sometimes they just add that word that makes it sound a little more important, even if it's nonsense. So cut down those wooden trees. And then what happened, the soldiers throughout the war keep throwing it back in his face. Pass me that wooden stake. Give me that. Anyway. So that kind of a tradition also brought out these wonderful little coincidences. For instance, like those of you who can see, if it's clear, the definition of typewriter is a kind of a machine gun. So if you heard a typewriter, obviously this is gold for me, is shooting and is fear of death, right? And then there's a kind of twist on that tradition. You can see here there's the memoir of an American volunteer ambulance driver in the First World War that had at the end of it a glossary of terms. But his glossary of terms was different. He didn't mean to actually translate to you how the soldier speaks. He, in a way, showed you what he thinks when he hears these words or uses these words. So for instance, alarm, a signal given in the trenches that the enemy is about to attack, frequently false. It is mainly used to break up Tommy's dreams of home. Tommy is the nickname for a British soldier. Shell, a device of the artillery which sometimes makes Tommy wish he had been born in a neutral country. And this is my personal favorite. Trench, a ditch full of water, rats, and soldiers, in that order. Right? During his visit to France, notice the word visit, Tommy uses these ditches as residences. Now and again he sticks his head over the top to take a look at the surrounding scenery. If he's lucky, he lives to tell his mates what he saw. So what is the function of this dictionary? To pull you into the way of life that is being there. Not just the words, what they mean, but what kind of culture, I would say, uses words like that. What kind of way of thinking is fostered by that. And so we instilled in the workshop a dictionary class. This is the text we read to them. They always find it hilariously funny because they're like, how come, which is one of the, if there's a countdown of my favorite reactions of students in literature classes, it's empathy with someone you never dreamed you would ever empathize with. And so an Israeli soldier reading about an American soldier serving in the British Army in 1917, that's surprising. They don't expect to see that. And then that bred an exercise focused on dictionaries. So should I show examples? All right. So I gave you a few examples. For whatever weird reason, I kept the Hebrew original. These are all handwritten because that's how they write in the workshop. So happiness. Actually, and I should say, the workshop, we never instruct them to write about the war. That's not a rule. They can write about whatever they'd like. Obviously, they all know why they're there. And there was a conversation about why they came and what they want to take from it. But in the text we give to them to read and in the interaction in the class, it's up to them to raise the topic. It's not something we would like to. All right, so happiness. Sometimes real, sometimes fake. Must show your surroundings it's there. Otherwise, you're broken. And in Hebrew, shavul even has beyond just broken. It's like undone, kind of, in a way. That's slang, Israeli slang, the young people, right? So what is happiness? Happiness is a mask, right? Hero, adjective, meant to describe a person we are unable to call unfortunate or dead. Which reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. There's a Vietnam poet by the name of Bruce Wiggle who says, all of my heroes are dead. It's up to me now through poetry to make... So anyway, he makes it seem as if the definition of hero is someone who's dead. And here there's two options, either dead or in Hebrew misken, which is something to be pitied, someone to be pitied, really, like not someone to like adore or valorize. It's someone who has been through something so severe that there's really not much left there anyway. Should I do more?
Maybe, yeah, one last.
We don't have to.
Okay. I mean, we all want to hear more, but maybe we can get it.
Save us for later.
Yeah, exactly. But we ended with heroes. So I do want to talk about national collective discourse. So we were talking about language as communication, and then the individual experiencing violence and then returning to that conversation, unable to find him or herself within that discourse. But there's also the collective level of nationalist discourse that really seems to ossify specific words by overusing them, by detaching them from concrete experience, as with the word hero or togetherness, or, I mean, there's a variety. I was wondering, where is the collision between the individual and the nationalist collective discourse? Does it make it even harder to use those tools of language when language, turns into this nationalist vocabulary, affect also? What do we make of these levels?
I would say that the collision is all the time, everywhere, and in a way, kind of the accepted public way of speaking about war. It doesn't even have to be overtly nationalist at times. It just needs to be the way everyone agrees to talk about it. Is the enemy of being able to describe what you're going through, and often quite violently enforced. So if there's the official dictionary, right, if you go to the official dictionary in the word hero, then you would get the official, what is it, denotation, connotation, of the word hero, right? A person who, whatever, beyond the call of duty, right? And then there's the word hero as it's used in public, which is much more loaded, much less specific to whatever, right? And in Israeli society, it was kind of thrown around, right? So at times, the people who rushed to enlist were heroes, then their wives were heroes because they stayed home with the kids, and then the kids were heroes, and then the people who were evacuated from their homes and had to, basically be internal refugees were heroes. And basically, heroes was a way to stamp the societally approved mode of behavior, mode of sacrifice, all of these things. And kind of a creation of a master dictionary, right? A meta dictionary with which these, I think one of the ways you see, one of the things you see in these examples is a real struggle with what that word now means, right? And so if you think a hero is someone dead, or if you think a hero is someone to be pitied, then that's at odds with what the public says a hero is. And I should say, as someone who is just a person who lived through that experience and continues to live through it, you know, it sometimes got really ridiculous, right? Beer companies putting like a silhouette of a soldier on a six-pack because it's the hero edition. It got like marketable. And so I can only imagine how someone feels when they have a real conflict with that word and they're just buying a beer and it's there also. In a way, that's the main conflict, right? That it's not what I mean. And language is a social, that's what we learn in Intro to Theory, right? Language is a social institution. Language is a symbolic institution, and it's kind of the emissary of whatever culture is determined by. And if you have an issue with language, that sometimes bleeds into this idea of having an issue with everything. With your parents, not being understood, with your fellow soldiers. One of the things that were raised in the class we participated in yesterday was not everyone experiences these struggles. Not everyone wants to write a new personal dictionary about pain. Some people find war to be quite fun. And so those people could also be kind of an obstacle to, right? I'm going through something that's very difficult. Well, I'm not. What's your problem? Why are you being soft? Why are you being confused? You need to take care of yourself. I'm fine. We're fine. The collective fine. Or happy, right? In this case, right? One of the fascinations with living in Israel is the ceremony known as hostage release, where everyone watches the TV and everyone is anxiously waiting to see and hear. I ask, waiting to see what? Weight loss, the appearance of sadness. What is it that you can see that would somehow validate your idea of what those people went through? And one of the things that are said, like on social media, for instance, is, and I'll use the Hebrew and I'll translate, דווקא הוא נראה בסדר, which is, oh, he looks fine, right? Which kind of is a version of he'll do fine. He'll do fine, right? Fine, happy, okay, all these versions. Pull your socks up, stop harping on, forget, and so on. And so there's a real need for the individual to say, stop. Something happened. I know that by my stopping, the great wheels of society are grinding to a halt and people resent me for that. That is always the case. Even if there's great empathy for soldiers or for people who experience great pain during war, enough time passes from the war and it becomes old hat and to the point of, let's not talk about this anymore, even if it's not expressively said. And so there's a real need for the individual to say, no, meaning has changed. I can't go on. I can't go on making as if I'm fine because it's not fine. And so I think that's why, to also kind of backwardly answer your question, I think that's why sometimes the experience of the person saying, stop, I need to figure this out, there's often hostility there. That's another form of struggle, of get out of it, snap out of it, right? You need to go back to university. All the soldiers in my workshop, I don't know if you mentioned this, are all university students. So they're in and out of war and then back to class because they have to make up for lost time. So they feel pressure, and then they know their friends who weren't enlisted don't feel that pressure, and so they resent them. You had all this time to study, I don't. My future will be impacted by my inability to get a good grade. And the other way around, because the people who universities are trying to cater for returning soldiers to the best of their abilities, and so the people who weren't enlisted envy the kind of breaks the soldiers get. They get, a second opportunity to do the test, and they're like, that's not fair. Why does he get a second break and I don't? I just experienced air raids for 3 months. I mean, my life was great. So all of this is not fine. And I think, speaking to the logistical aspect of how the workshop came to be, we are all in the workshop, and maybe, everyone, all the people who were leading the workshop were very cognizant of the fact that we were on borrowed time. That whoever gave us the money and the room will not be able to give us the money and the room in a couple of months from now, because it won't be a pressing issue anymore.
Yeah, so that's precisely what I wanted to ask, the question about temporality. But I also have another question, so I don't know if we have time for 2 more questions, yeah? Okay. So one is, and this is about your scholarship, but also your experience in the workshops, is there a difference between writing during war and writing after war? Or I would even say, is there a difference between writing in the field itself or even during war when you're at the university and you're looking back?
That's a wonderful question.
Thank you.
There are many ways to answer that. The simple way is to say that writing during war, if it's even possible, not everyone has access, and I should say that people talk about the arts, right? What does it matter if my son has a creative writing class at school? He's not going to be a writer. It's time better spent if he has another, remedial math class, so you can become an engineer and make a lot of money and please his mother and his father, right? I'm, by the way, a complete failure in my family's life. Anyway, so the arts is in this regard, if you have that inclination, if you are aware of the option to write in a time of great anguish or disconnect, then you have a whole first aid kit that other people don't. And sometimes that can save your life. Not always, but sometimes. And so, yeah, the arts, yay. And so, okay, but other than that, I would say that if it is possible for you to write during war, then I'll start with the second part of your question. During the workshop, we saw a great variety, even months apart. First workshop was June 2024. Very grateful to be there. Some of them were kind of budding authors, but not all of them. Usually kind of the minority is kind of the author type. Some issues of trying to kind of communicate their experiences to their surroundings, dealing with the fact that suddenly there's this huge war that came out of nowhere, etc. Second wave was a few months later, already kind of in and out of war for a few times, and it feels like they want to talk about it, but they're not sure they can talk about it or should talk about it, because they're in about 2 weeks they'll be back. Or sometimes if something happened, we're called back during the workshop and then came back to the workshop. Some people's military service is insane in that they serve in some kind of intelligence office that sees horrific things from drone overview, but it's an office job. This is a known, by the way, problem with drone operators in the States, for instance, that their trauma isn't I was there, it's I pulled a joystick and ate dinner with my family. And so we had one of those, not really operating, but like intelligence, and so she would get called back suddenly, so she couldn't do next week's meeting, but in 2 weeks she was back. And very confused about everything. And so that was already different. It felt loaded. It felt like they wanted to unload so much that they were afraid that if they opened their mouth, like all this poison would draw out and they would drown. It felt overwhelming. And then the third group, which was even more fragmented, because in the middle of it, there was a war with Iran. And we had to figure out whether to do the last meeting on Zoom when everyone was in their shelters. And there, we began to see kind of the budding of critical thinking about the war, which wasn't really an issue before, to the point of, a person who, if I had to pick out of a lineup, a person who looks the part of, wants to be the most combative soldier, wants to do the most, and he's a med student, so he's always sacrificing his body for something. And out of all the people, he was the person who, when I mentioned the fact that there's very delicately, apropos of the conversation, it was not something I just kind of parachuted in, that there's a tradition in the war writing tradition of feeling empathy for the enemy soldier because he too is, pardon my language, screwed over by his officers just like I am. It's very, World War I is kind of the hallmarks of that tradition. And I just said that not really expecting to get anything because it's a very incorrect or inappropriate or treasonous thing to say in Israeli society out loud, that you feel any kind of empathy with enemy combatants. And he said, yeah, I feel that. And he said, sometimes when my helicopter wants to kill him, my buddies get killed. So we're both in this. We can both end our lives just like that. And he and me are the same. So that's how that changed. And I just want to say from the scholarship point of view, the books that are written decades following the event usually get closer to what we would call something like postmodern literature, even if they're not in a postmodern setting. That they're much more complicated and much more interrogative of how, for instance, I was brought up. What was it about my upbringing that made me think that war was a good thing for me to try out? What will happen with my children? So the temporal aspect becomes much more complicated when it, I think also because a lot of that time was spent not writing. And so when you first pick up your pen and it's 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, your view of what that war did in your life is broader and in a way you could say deeper.
I think I have time for one more question, so I'm going to ask two, and you choose.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's like a game. It's fun.
Agency.
Yeah, so the first question was about agency, right? So the question was about the difference between perhaps American writings that you work with in your scholarship and the Israeli audience that you are working with, whether the question of agency is different in war writing, with the fact that in Israel enlisting is not a question of agency. You simply have to. While in the US, at least ostensibly, there is a choice, or at least one imagines that one has enlisted out of choice. And the second question, which we also covered yesterday, is about the reader and the writer. So we're talking here about people writing war poetry. Is there also a collective value to reading war poetry, right? So not only writing it, but also publishing it and having a kind of a conversation with an audience around these texts.
Okay, I feel like answering both.
Go for it, you got 9 minutes.
But I'll do it quickly. So I'm really focused, like within the workshop, on just it happening. And to an extent, them getting an edited collection of what they wrote so they can experience themselves as kind of a quasi-published author. So they can go completely full circle and then send it out, because it's a PDF, sending out to their parents if you want to, right? But Professor Efrat Hus, who is the social worker professor who works with us, is very adamant about the importance of these kinds of voices within Israeli public discourse. Because literature about the war has come out from the second the war erupted. And I think, at least at first, at least the way I see it, in a very kind of enlisted by and for the public discourse kind of way. So let's hear the beautiful poetry written by our heroes, kind of an idea. And again, the meaning of heroes changes, but still, that's the idea. And not necessarily a place for kind of a breakdown of personhood, an interrogation of the relationship between yourself and the collective, which is what happens when you interrogate language, among other things. So I think I've come to agree with that. And I think there's an importance for a certain public aspect to what we do that might happen sooner rather than later. I don't know. What was the first one? Was it agency?
Agency.
What agency and?
enlisting in the U.S. and in Israel?
Oh yeah, I think. What can I say? I think that there's an almost sense of weird melancholy when it comes to the Israeli case that stems from this lack of choice. Now, lack of choice, we should qualify, is both a real and unreal thing. Especially when it comes to reserve soldiers, which are the soldiers that I've been dealing with, not people who are within their 3-year mandatory service. And why do I say it's a real and unreal thing? It's a real thing because they're obligated by law to respond when they're called up, and that's it. There's no if or buts about it, and if they don't, then they face anything from public shame to whatever legal ramifications. But that it isn't real because they can also not go. And I'm not sure whatever it is that drives them to either choose that way or another is just moral compass. Some people go and they think it's a horrible idea. And some people don't go and they think it's fine, but they just don't feel like it. It's not really a very cut and dry situation. In a way, kind of Israeli society propels you, if you will, to just arrive and suddenly be in uniform and in a very dangerous place, and then start questioning what it was that made you go there. I know from my own personal experience that's how I felt. I hated it with a passion, but I somehow did it, which is a question to be asked. And so there's this tragic tone of I was forced to do this that is both kind of connected to reality and disconnected to reality at the same time.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you.
But I'm sure there are many other people who want to ask, so let's open it up to conversation.
Thank you for sharing your experiences with these workshops. I wonder whether you notice any difference between the British and American models that you started with and what happens in Israel, reflecting the fact that other soldiers in other wars are split, are wrenched away from their social context for extended periods of time, months or years. Whereas in Israel, we go to Miluim, right? We go to reserve duty, and then we come home to do our laundry on to the weekends. Does that affect the way that the soldiers experience and conceptualize?
I would say yes, and this kind of piggybacks Yael's question about the difference in general. And I would say I assigned a tragic tone to the Israeli side, which has to do with this frequency, right? Because and I think this war specifically is the most radical in that sense, because it was the longest, and in that period, it wasn't just one solid block of military service. It was, you're back home, you're called back. You're back home, you're called back. And so if I assign this tragic tone to the Israeli side, then I would say the counterpart in the American and British side, that has to do with the fact that they were torn and come back. There's a sense of grandeur and grandiosity of the event, and of kind of an inability to connect with the everydayness and the meaninglessness of what they find at home. You do find that in the Israeli, at least in the workshops. Some people say, I felt like a demigod when I was at war, and here I'm just a student who's like, please, can I have an extension to my test? I felt very demoted by civilian life. But for the most part, that's a very American experience of coming back home, and what is this mall, and what are you guys dealing with? Nothing, with the, tepid, meaningless things. There are bigger things awaiting, or what I experienced was, the world to an extent. I traveled, I saw different cultures, I saw big events. And in Israel, there not only isn't that grandeur, it's almost kind of aborted at birth, because you're always going to end up coming to a home where your dad was at war, or your granddad was at war, which I think in the Israeli model is one of those ghosts you need to deal with when you decide that your experience is worthy enough to even write about. Because of who am I, right? Who am I? I'm in the long chain of, like, I know this is very deterministic and I don't agree with it necessarily. In the long chain of Jewish suffering, who am I? And so it's not a question of meaninglessness, it's a question of how do I fit in, or I am experiencing myself as not being able to fit in. Why is that? Right? My dad did fine. Spoiler alert, he did not. He just never talked about it. And what you experience as normal, as fine, is really suppression, repression, and not fine. And kind of sporadic bouts of anger, which I'm guilty of in the last 2 years as well, because I have 3 young children and I'm stressed out of my mind. And that leads to an imperfect way of reacting to, you know, Daddy, I want more screen time, you know. And so I'm not perfect in that way, but I think that would be one major difference.
Hello.
Hello.
The American and British veterans that you pulled poetry from the darkest reaches of the internet.
Yes.
How aware, excuse me, how aware are they of you and how you interact with their poetry and of your workshops? And if so, is there any cross-pollination, any of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and through my answer, I will kind of expose, at least in my, I have problems. We can talk about our problems, right? And one of my problems is that the way I see the humanities research, both because I was pounded into my cognitive, you know, pounded into me, and because of maybe of my own character, and you know, is that it's very difficult for me to go from one way of thinking to the other. Just kind of hop over. Just like the starting of this workshop is a kind of a revolution for me that required a lot of self-work. And the reason I say that is I never even thought of talking to them until the point came where I had to publish their poetry and get their permission. And it was only then, silly me, it dawned on me that they weren't, you know, in fact dead, that I can send emails. Which is a weird thing in literature in general. Like, I don't send emails to Kurt Vonnegut. I suspect horrible emails on his side, but it's not something that was part of me. And then I started writing emails, and I got responses saying, that's crazy. Where did this come from, right? For the most part. There were some negative responses too. But one of the responses was a person who I worked on his poetry like throughout the years before even completing my book and through my PhD, and I wrote an essay about him, so I didn't need to ask his permission because it was a scholarly journal, it wasn't a commercial publication. And he said, oh yeah, I know you wrote an essay about me, thank you man, that really means a lot. I was like, what the hell is going on here? And the kind of the zenith of that was that one of the authors that was really near and dear to my heart, which is a female American war veteran who was sexually assaulted during her military service, so it was a very different kind of experience. She showed up to my Zoom book launch. Like, there was a Zoom book launch and she was one of the squares. And I was very touched by that. And then later she did like a video essay, a poetic video essay about how she felt about her poetry being read by a guy in Israel who wrote, and she quoted my book about her. And I was like, what the hell is going on? So that's, they're not aware of the workshops. There's probably a good idea to raise that topic. I think some of them at least were involved in workshops. She specifically was published because it was a collection published by a workshop in England. But maybe I should tell them about it. Maybe that's a good idea.
Have you ever heard of Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut?
Yes, I have.
What is the title of your book?
Which one?
All of them.
The one that I talked about right now with the poets from Afghanistan, and it's called Poetics Prosthetics.
How much is it?
There's a paperback now, so maybe not as bad.
Okay, I'm gonna read it. And I was also enjoying what you had to say about the cans of beer and the heroes and the, that whole thing, because of just all races, But I also wanted to say that I really enjoyed listening to you. You're
Thank you.
an amazing speaker, and you have just volumes and volumes to share. And I'm so grateful to be here, and I want to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you. That was worth me coming. Thank you. I'll tell my wife about you said that. Thank you very much. What's your name?
Sierra.
Sierra, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I wonder if you, both in the workshop and also in your scholar studies, what you didn't talk about the element of the sense of justice or of the justification of being in the war. And again, here we have a very special case in this war because, first of all, as time changed, and for 2 years, many soldiers started going to the war thinking it's the most justified thing, and later they were there and they couldn't even bring themselves to refuse, and thought that it's totally unjustified.
Yeah.
So the sense of justification, how does it affect the workshop, the writing, and again compared to the war that you studied?
So in that case, I said before grandeur and tragedy, here it's flipped. Because I have so much to say about this, so I'll try to bring myself down. But so the war started, there was this onrush of a sense of importance, of national pride, of defending, and obviously what we all saw with our naked eye, vengeance. So as part of this discourse, right? So it's a rightful vengeance, it's a righteous vengeance, right? And I think for that reason, mostly, justification never really came up in the workshops at all. At first, for sure not. I say it, with the advancing iterations, it started being propped up. For instance, one of the participants shared the moment where he was in class, which is already weird for him because whatever we just talked about, and suddenly he gets a call up. He's told he's about to be called back up, and he tells his mom, and his mom texts him mid-class, "Don't go." And he is so distraught by this interaction that he has to physically leave the classroom and go to the toilet. Not to the toilet, but just to the room, which I thought was fascinating, but again, I would not have interrogated that for him. Freud is not the moment in that specific, right? And he had to kind of start justifying himself to her, not to the state of Israel. So the mother, the older generation, already caught on that this is not worth the risk. And she's asking him not to go. And there are other stories, I'm just now reminded by this, of another soldier who, when the war broke out, came from abroad, especially to enlist, which was amazing to see. Amazing in all the meanings of that word. And his mom came to him to pick him up at the airport with the uniform, crying. Which is a terrible moment for many reasons, right? On the one hand, she's enabling this, right? Here, the uniform, let's go. And already processing the tragedy of it at the same time, right? So as now with the new wave of workshops, I expect to see justification pop up more because that's just been the trend. But I also remind myself to be forgiving of both these people and their families, and to an extent to be forgiving even to the psychotic seizure which took hold of society in a general, because it always takes time. It almost never is the case that a war becomes unjustified immediately and the repercussions become apparent immediately. It takes time. I know that's cruel and horrible to everyone who suffers as a result of that delay. That's unfair. That's not a fair thing, I'm saying. But the reality is, I think it takes time. And to your question, if it is part of your story that is a completely justified endeavor, and if in your own experience you never committed, for instance, a war crime, you never did anything to make anyone feel like it's an unjust war, what would then be your reaction to claims of an unjust action? You would do your best to block that out, because that shines back on you and then retroactively tells you, remember when you went out and you're all filled with fervor to protect the Jewish people? That may have been a mistake. That's almost unbearable. And so I think that takes time.
I wanted to go back to your sort of comments about the broken dictionary and sort of how do you sort of said, how do I bring the ordinary together with the extraordinary? And to me that there's a lot of literature also around Holocaust testimonies that relates to that. So I wonder if you've drawn on those. Like I think of Lawrence Langer, who writes a lot about Holocaust testimonies and sort of deep memory and the things that can't be retrieved or understood by others, and sort of that challenge of like translating that experience. So I was thinking about that and wondered your thoughts. And then I have one other question if I can slip in, or at least sort of, I think Yael and I both experienced this writer of Dog, and we had a webinar around it, and there's many things in your conversation that I think make me think back to that. But I think they sort of also relate to this tension around national or collective discourse, and even your comment about your grandmother ties back to that in this sense, sort of that there are sort of dominant narratives around particular events. Like we think about the Holocaust, we think about Auschwitz, and so there are those narratives that don't fit, right? And so even sort of the notion of heroism and sort of narratives of the experience of the war that don't fit that, and what you do with them and how you bridge. So I was thinking about that question as well, but even sort of the way in which your grandmother internalized certain narratives as being sort of those narratives of suffering, and yet hers was not that. It was a different experience, and I wonder if that sort of, when we think about those coming back whose experiences don't fit the sort of heroism narrative that's in the public discourse, sort of how you bridge that gap.
Well, I think that's one of the things that silences you, right? Because if it doesn't fit the heroism discourse, then you shouldn't talk about it. In the case of, for instance, the way the Holocaust survivors were received at first in Israel, that has to do with shame, right? That if you survived, it's either because you were, you rebelled in the Warsaw Ghetto, which means you're dead, or you somehow cheated your way out of a life and death situation and thus are suspect for surviving. And survivor guilt, which is, that notion, is across the board. Having survived is a problem. Envying the dead is a problem, right? Because they don't have to deal with this. They are just, forever young, right? Forever beautiful, forever heroic, forever, and no one really knows if what they did was heroic. We know that war is funny that way. We know, for instance, the statistic that between 25 and 33% of those killed in Israeli wars are killed by what's called friendly fire. So that's almost a third of families who mourn a story that really isn't the story. It's an accident, which brings out the chaotic nature of war, obviously, but not necessarily what they can hang on to, right? As to your question about, I didn't think about Holocaust testimony when we worked about the workshop, probably due to my own personal failings and the quickness with which we had to think about what we wanted to do on the fly and doing it. But it might be something that I'd like to get into. I wonder if it's something that they would like to discuss. I kind of off the top of my head would say no, but that's interesting given the fact that the Holocaust was such prominent subject in the public discourse. Since I am a person with a room filled with catastrophes, then I know that the way people reacted to October 7th specifically wasn't really a post-Holocaust reaction, it's a post-pogrom reaction. It's much more in that line of literary reaction to suddenly someone suddenly came to the village and did horrible things, right? Unspeakable things. And where is my sense of security now, and so on and so forth. But because we live in Israel and the Holocaust is such a presence, and because the Holocaust is such a big part of why people even think Israel has a right to exist, and because pogroms are conceived as these pre-state, sterilized, diasporic, weak, and so on and so forth, then it's not even, doesn't even occur to them that it's really a pogrom. So I hope I answered those. Yael mentioned dog. I admit I haven't heard about it, but I have it written down for me, and thank you.
And I'll also add that in one of Ron's own novels, he combines really the temporality of the Holocaust and him being in military service, and the way that this blends into one consciousness or one experience of the world.
Yeah,
so read it.
The example is, I'm going to spoil the book you're not going to read. So the opening scene is like, it describes the time of my birth, which is, I didn't say it in the book, but I'll tell you now. It's March 19th, 1944. So I was born the day my mother's grandfather was arrested and sent to Auschwitz from Budapest, right? Because that story was such a mythological presence in my mind that whatever that my story is, it began there. Because I was born because he was arrested and his wife wasn't. So the fact that she wasn't enabled me to be alive. And so that's where my life begins. That's the kind of fork in the road where I'm born. And I'm dead in 2006 as a very kind of decrepit soldier waiting to get into Lebanon and not wanting to die. And kind of having to kind of, how should I say, acquiesce to death. And kind of resisting at first, and then saying, you know what, maybe the easy way out is just to acquiesce to death. And then having to deal with the fact that you didn't die. So that to me was my story. So it's informed obviously by all these stories, but not everyone has that in their background. But I think it's pretty safe to say that it's fairly common for an Israeli family to have at least 2 levels of this going back. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, you had mentioned before how urgent it was to get people to talk about their pain early. And I was thinking about, there's a whole kind of cottage industry in the US about helping people process PTSD with psychedelics or other kinds of processes. And I'm interested in your workshop in the sense that you had people who were coming and going from war. And I wonder if what you think about your workshops and the kind of psychoanalysis aspect and also the literary production aspect, is it to produce healthy soldiers, like to bring soldiers back to the ability to fight, or is the process of processing make you unable to be a soldier anymore?
So that's a great question. Okay, so many things. The first thing is that literature is not a way out of violence. Literature for people sometimes is an invitation to violence, irregardless of what the author meant or didn't mean. Someone can read Moby Dick and say, I want to be a sailor. Can't do anything with that. Maybe you can say, maybe you misread, but he still wants to be a sailor, right? And someone can see All Is Quiet on the Western Front and want to be a soldier. You can't do anything with that. Someone can watch Platoon, if you want a more recent example, and say, that looks great. I want profound experiences that make me a broken person, because that's what being a man is, being broken and silent. I want that, right? And so I can't say it's a way out, because there's always the kind of a way in as well. But what's interesting about what you said is because there is also the cottage industry in Israel of dealing with, and because we got soldiers in the workshop who've been through a few rounds of these, and because they stated the difference for them, I can speak somewhat securely about what I think is different. I think the army is very much interested in getting the liability off its back. the Army, which is very interested in kind of arranging workshops. When I was a soldier, no one arranged a workshop for me, and now they're very active in that and funding it and arranging it. And sometimes they fly out, you know, soldier groups to Romania to do like hiking and talking circles and whatever. So it's very active. And I think, call me cynical, but I think part of it is about making a more healthy soldier, because realizing there's money to be lost if he goes apeshit, excuse my speech, and we have to pay him for the rest of his life because he's disabled now. So it's that kind of money-oriented, budget-oriented version of mental health. And I also think that the difference is that you don't write there. And that's a big difference. Talking is important. But what happens more often than not in those groups is that you're in a group of your peers. So if you're an infantry soldier, sometimes they find it more beneficial if you're surrounded by your friends. So yes, there's a variety of reactions within that group, but you only feel safe to speak with someone who had the exact same experience as you. And beyond the fact that we write in our workshop, that's not the case. So the most prominent example is we had a very, like he's part of the military search and rescue unit, like very kind of upper echelon of prestige. And he was very dismissive. He didn't say it, but you could see. He was very dismissive. He said, I don't want to get into this whose trauma is greater competition, which is very clear he meant that his wins that competition. And I should say, you know, in parenthesis, he's right. I mean, he saw some crazy shit. But he still had to deal with the fact that someone else across the table was experiencing unimaginable pain that he can identify with, despite the fact that it's a woman who worked at the IDF spokesman's office in a hospital. And that her great struggle was seeing dead people, even though she's not part of the medical team. She's just there to cover whatever, to kind of do the outside facing to the families and so on and so forth. And she would see, because she was there, all the helicopters coming in, all the dead people coming in, and then just walk. In Beersheba, which is where I teach, the hospital is across the road. So you would just go through one crosswalk and you're at the university. So her experience was vastly different than his. And also, I think gender matters here. The fact that she's a woman and she knows exactly what he's talking about. He suddenly realized, oh wait, it's not really just about me. Everyone's in pain. And my pain isn't superior to others because I was in a quote-unquote superior position. Everyone is, and I think that was one of the most important aspects of that group, the variety of it, and the writing, which I didn't get to, but thank you very much for your question.
Hey. Question about the unspeakable. Asking also, as a teacher during the war in Israel, I had my students experience various things that I don't know much about, but like I'd have the occasional student coming and saying, I'm going to miss the next assignment because I'm going back to the military.
Yeah.
And probably, you know, a few months ago or a few weeks ago, there was a video that went viral by a comedian who talked about his post-trauma.
Yeah, with Kagan, yeah.
Yes. So for people who don't know, that was like it was a funny video, quite long, 20 minutes or so, talking about his trauma from the military without really saying it. And it received, I think, generally positive reactions, a lot of empathy.
Some backlash.
Some. And I think the criticism was like, but you didn't say. Like, you could be loved by everybody, right wing, left wing, whatever, all sides, because there was something that was unspoken, and that is like, he says it for like a few brief seconds, and that's like what's haunting him over the years, and he uses drugs and alcohol, and it's like the sentence of, how could you do that?
Yeah.
And I imagine it's very difficult to get people to open up and talk about it in the workshops and so on. Sorry. And then there's the ineffable, again, the unspeakable. And I'm wondering, is this acknowledged in the workshop? Probably the facilitators don't approach this because it's too painful. But I imagine a subgroup of people looking at this viral video and hearing something completely different, and that is their own post-trauma. So like it resonates differently with different audiences. And probably you're conscious of this, but how do you deal with it?
Well, okay, so it does come up. Obviously, as you said, it's not something we elicit because, I mean, basically we don't elicit anything thematically. We just elicit the act of writing and then it's up to them. But in conversation and in writing, there were offhanded comments, interestingly, both made by female soldiers whose job it was in kind of the Air Force command to pick targets and to be part of a group that argues, is this a legitimate target or not? And so part of their experiences was those arguments and the things said in those arguments, where sometimes they felt someone was crossing a moral threshold, like, I don't care what happens, what are you making a fuss about this? Which was kind of jarring for her. And another one in a similar position who said, yeah, I go to school and then on Thursdays I go and bomb people in Tel Aviv, because that's where the control center is. It's very weird. And I think maybe because of the fact that it's a very female experience within a very male-dominated office, right, of being belittled, your opinion is being belittled, but then along the way hearing about, really, wait, that doesn't sound legal, right? Some of the things that they said. But also the kind of the level of defamiliarization is so great that you're in an office in Tel Aviv making life and death decisions and sometimes making the wrong decision. And there's a profound sense of shame. We never really interrogated it because the rule of thumb was that they give what they give and we don't push beyond that. But I should say, I was very happy to have a social worker partner with me for those moments, because I would not have been able to either deal with it or to restrain myself from pushing it further. And he was very good about that, and I always kind of deferred to him. But that idea of shame was there. And another example, we talked about games and playing parts. It's the name of one of the exercises. And one of them said, it's funny, in training we used to do as if it's a war, and I haven't done that in so long because it's only been a real war for a whole time. And then another person said, well, when I was in war, it felt like a game. We'd go from house to house, we'd do these weird things, and it felt like it was a game. And it was only after we got back home that I realized that it wasn't a game. And this is a person who also testified to having severe post-traumatic symptoms of shaking limbs when he went into class and things like that. So it was obvious that in that moment he was talking about shame. That how could I, right, have been so light about something so serious? But that's the extent to which it came up. She asked about the writing exercises, right? And about whether or not feelings of shame or guilt came up during the process. I should say that the process is not geared towards shame and guilt. It's geared toward people talking and constructing kind of their own vocabulary. And one of the things that I emphasize, is style. Style to me is very important. Obviously not in the physical sense. It's not very important. Or if it is, then I'm failing horribly. But style. Recognize how you write. And not that you write, you write, and within a group setting you understand that your writing is different from other people's writing. Try to establish to yourself throughout the exercises what it is that makes your writing different, what about it do you like and you would like to emphasize more, and what about it do you not so like and would like to emphasize less. And the idea was that by the end of the workshop you will have a body of writing, and B, information about your writing, who you are as a writer. And your voice, exactly. And not necessarily in terms of now that you found your voice, you can now become a Nobel laureate in literature. That's not the point. The point is that that idea of style informs your emotional reactions. It teaches you about how you react to things. Some people ask questions all the time. Some people write in poetic form. Some people rhyme. Some people don't. Some people write essays. I think it matters, those differences. So that's what we're trying to get. And like I said before, shame and or guilt came up later in the duration of those workshops, and kind of few and far between because it really was a loaded subject. But in terms of what the exercises were, I don't think we kind of settled on a sequence that begins with writing a letter, moves on to writing about a role you feel like you fill in life that isn't really you, who you really are. There's a dictionary. There's write about a specific moment that is not narrative, because again, the assumption is that the most difficult moments are not narrative moments, they're just like blotches in the middle of your memory bank that you can't access. And so if you're instructed to write something that is essentially fragmentary, then maybe, and it is the case, that's the hardest meeting. The real kind of difficult things come up in that meeting. And then nature, because I have this fascination with nature, and they're always very confused about that question. What do you mean nature? There wasn't no nature in war. And then suddenly they were reminded, oh yeah, Gaza was at the beach. Oh yeah, there was a tree I saw that reminded me of home, a sunset, and so on and so forth. So that, and I think to also kind of zoom in and zoom out, right? Fragmentary and just little old me and big nature. And then the last 3 or 2, depending on the length of the workshop, meetings are geared at kind of reading what they've read so far, talking about style, what they think their style is, how they would change something they've already written, and then giving them tools having to do with editing going forward. Because just to be able to write in a very specific context is good, but we want to give them something that they could then utilize later. And the editing eye, which is also the public eye, I'm ashamed of giving my poetry to someone else because they'll think it sucks. The editing eye, internalizing the editing eye is a very big part of the transitioning back into life.
Have you ever heard of "You Are Not My Cannon Fodder"? Once, I guess years ago, I had a friend who was asked by a police officer, he was like homeless and he was hitchhiking or backpacking, he was out in the wilderness, and the police officer asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Nature."
My current project, what I'm writing about right now, is nature. And one of the things I'm writing about is soldiers who feel more comfortable in nature than they do with people after war. So this is very relevant to what you said. Thank you. Thank you again.
So I think we're at a close, so please join us to thank Ron and Yael.
Thank you for having me.
For a really amazing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.